Article 3, the Judicial Branch. In this one, we're going to look at the Judicial Branch, which is the branch that deals with all of the courts in the United States. The judicial, when you think judicial, you could think a judge. When you think a judge, you probably think a court. That's what the Judicial Branch is all about, is looking at laws, making sure that they're being followed, but also interpreting whether or not a law has been broken. When you guys did all the assignments about people's rights being violated or not violated, like the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fifth Amendment, and the Eighth Amendment, when you looked at all those amendments and you were deciding whether or not someone's rights were violated, you guys were doing what the Judicial Branch does. They look at cases and they decide if somebody's rights have been violated or not, or if a law has been broken or not. So we'll look at the actual powers of the Judicial Branch and figure out what they're able to do. We'll talk about the importance of those powers. We'll be able to figure out what types of powers the actual Judicial Branch has, and how we make sure the Judicial Branch doesn't become corrupt. So what is the Judicial Branch? Remember, when you hear Judicial Branch, I want you to think judge, because I think when we think judge, we think court, and that's what the Judicial Branch is. The country's court system is what the Judicial Branch is. They look at laws and determine the meaning of them. So they interpret the laws. They look at the laws and decide if they've been broken or not in court cases. They also have to decide how laws should be applied. And then they decide if laws break the rules. So sometimes they'll look at a law and decide if something about the law is unfair or goes against the Constitution. So that's their job. They look at laws, they look at specific cases, and they just try and make sure that laws are being followed, and they try and make sure that laws are upholding the Constitution, are not going against something that's in the Constitution. That's what they do. Some more about it. The Supreme Court is the main court in the Judicial Branch. It's the highest court in the United States. There's 9 judges. It's a little bit different than a normal courtroom that you might see in your town or in a movie or anything like that. There's actually 9 judges that hear cases. And the president is the person that gets to pick those judges, remember. They hear around 150 cases per year. That's a lot. They don't have to have any specific qualifications for being a Supreme Court justice. Pretty much anyone can. But obviously you should probably have been a lawyer or a judge beforehand. They're not just going to pick up a random person off the street to make into a Supreme Court justice. They pick 9 judges to be on the Supreme Court because it's an odd number. Because at the end of each case, they vote to decide who's right or who's wrong in the case. And a lot of times the votes are close. A lot of times 5 judges think one way and 4 judges think another way. But making it an odd number makes it so there can never be a tie. How do they get their job? Remember, they're picked by the president. So the president comes up with somebody that they think should be a Supreme Court justice. And then once the president has done that, the Senate, who remember is part of the legislative branch, gets to decide if that person is good enough for the job. So the Senate would have to approve the person that the president picked. If the Senate approves them, they get to be a Supreme Court justice, and they get that job for life. It's a little bit different from some of the other positions that are in our government. Once you become a Supreme Court justice, you don't have to leave. You don't have to get reelected. You don't have to campaign. You don't have to do any of that. Once you get that job, it's yours until you don't want it anymore. Now, it's the same thing with the president, though. If you do something wrong, and there's other people in the government that decide that you shouldn't be in that position anymore because you've done something wrong, you can be removed from the position. So they can be impeached just like the president can. But unlike the president, they don't have to be reelected. They don't have to campaign. We don't vote for those people. That's the main difference between the legislative, executive branch, and the judicial branch. We don't pick the people that are in the judicial branch. A little bit more about it. The person that's the top judge is called the Chief Justice, and he or she is the head or the top person in the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has 9 justices in it, like we said, but then there's even lower courts too. There's courts that hear things that maybe aren't as serious as things that the Supreme Court hears. They're called circuit courts and district courts, and it goes down to even trial courts, civil courts, and criminal cases. So there's all kinds of courts, but the big one that I want you guys to focus on is the Supreme Court. They're the ones that focus on things like we've done in some of the pod activities, where they look at people's rights and decide whether they've been violated or not. So what are their checks on the other branches? How can they influence the other branches? Basically, anything that the other branches do, the Supreme Court looks at and can decide if they're unconstitutional, meaning if they go against the Constitution. So anything that the president does, the judicial branch can look at and decide if it goes against the Constitution or not. Same thing with the legislative branch. Any laws that the legislative branch passes, the judicial branch can look at and decide if they go against the Constitution or not. So the judicial branch is kind of like the watchdog. They're looking over the other two branches, making sure that everything that they do follows the Constitution. They're almost like the referee of the government. So what does that have to do with you? This is the one that, like I said, it keeps the other two in check because it's watching over them to make sure what they do does not violate the Constitution. If they're violating the Constitution, they're probably hurting us in some way. So the judicial branch is there for our protection, to make sure that our rights are protected from the other two branches, the legislative and the executive. A lot of court cases, if you feel like your rights have been violated, it can go all the way up as high as the Supreme Court if it makes it through all of those other cases. And that's happened a bunch of times, even with students your age. And we're going to look at some examples of cases where that's happened in live class. So the Supreme Court also makes major decisions. They look at big court cases, and a lot of the things that they decide become policy for the whole country. You guys have probably heard of Brown versus the Board of Education, which is a court case about whether or not schools should be mixed in terms of race. The Supreme Court decided that they should be, so that decision was passed down through the entire country, and they made it so schools had to integrate, which meant that schools had to accept people of all races, not just a school for white kids or a school for African American kids. So when they make these decisions, they sweep down and affect the entire country. So that was a brief, quick synopsis, kind of summary of what the judicial branch does. If you need help, just contact me. Be sure to join us for a class on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My contact information is there if you need any help. If not, good luck.